So to succeed in business, it's knowledge, skills, drive, creativity, but it's also sleeping, exercising, eating well, things like that, and nurturing your relationships, because that whole person, let me put it this way, you need to have well-being in all of those aspects.
This is the Greenwich Means Business podcast.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Greenwich Means Business podcast. Today we have an amazing, really cool speaker, Mr. Keith Mould. Keith Mould, do you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. So first, Natalie, thanks for having me on your podcast. It's always good to talk about the things that I have some passion for. So I'm quite new to the UK, first of all, and obviously to Greenwich. Thank you. And I'm also relatively new to academia. So I'm more of a practitioner academic, and I have a varied background. So I started off in the corporate world and had a pretty good career there. And then I started up a couple of my own businesses. And then for the last 15 years or so, I've been taking what I learned in those experiences and helping smaller businesses grow.
Wow.
And that brought me to academia.
Wow, well, do you enjoy it?
I do. It's really good.
Yeah,
Thanks.
and what do you do at the Greenwich Business School?
So I'm with the Executive Business Centre, and all the MBAs are housed in that group. And my particular focus is on change management and also strategic leadership and management. And outside of teaching, I'm involved in our knowledge exchange activities where we reach out into the community to smaller businesses, share information with them from our research and learn from them and hopefully help them thrive.
Wow. Can you give me an example of that, how you're helping small businesses?
Yeah, we have, for instance, one particular business on a skills development program of ours. It's a local football club, actually. And so the director of the sporting side of the club is looking to reach out into communities, to different age groups, build their brand, if you like, and attract those at grassroots level into their academy. And obviously, hopefully, that some of them, graduate into their teams, but at the same time, they give them a really well-rounded development, sort of, let's call it responsible citizenry kind of set of skills.
Wow, that's really cool. Okay, so I'm a student, and I think one day I would love to open my own business. I think it's most of our Greenwich Business School students want to open their businesses. So what's step one? So you have the idea, what would you say is step one at a student level? So I'm a second year marketing and brand management student. What would be my next step if I wanted to open a business? I don't know what business yet. I don't know. I'm trying to think of an example to give you, but let's just call it a business. Okay. But what would your step one be? What do you think?
Okay. So particularly if you're kind of going into entrepreneurship and you're starting off, you need to have some kind of burning passion to do what you want to do.
A mindset.
Well, the mindset, exactly. So the mindset will guide you and your passion will carry you through, because I have to say from personal experience, there are some dark days ahead when you do that, because you've got to sort of refine your idea, you've got to gather around resources, maybe funding, maybe business partners, team members, and so on. And it takes time to refine those things, and you do meet obstacles along the way. So the mindset that can keep you focused on your sort of ultimate goal helps you navigate those challenges.
Wow.
In a nutshell.
That makes sense, yeah. So just going back to mindsets, what would be like the perfect mindset to have in order to push through those dark days and to kind of like, because a lot of people, they don't believe in like being able to have that work-life balance and still being able to succeed. So do you think that there's some truth in that, or do you think perhaps you need to be a bit more like flexible and still make time to kind of like, look after your mental health and everything? Or do you think it's important to just keep pushing? What do you think?
So what I used to do when I started mine was I was married, I had a small child, and I said to my wife, look, I can't promise you I'll give you like your fair share of my attention every day, but I will make sure that every week I do that because, as you said, mental health, well-being is really important.
Yeah.
And actually, just touching on that work-life balance, what we do outside of this, I also coach leaders and so on. And one of the key things is to think not of work and life, because we have a life, right?
Yeah.
And so it's really about the whole person. So to succeed in business, it's knowledge, skills, drive, creativity, but it's also sleeping, exercising, eating well, things like that, and nurturing your relationships, because that whole person, let me put it this way, you need to have well-being in all of those aspects.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Maybe if I could just jump back to a previous point.
Yeah.
I don't want to overdo the point that there are dark days ahead, right? I don't want to put people off. But it's not necessarily that rosy, and people need to be realistic. So you need to have that end goal. And in terms of planning your business, people need to actually take a structured approach to it. And whether you're looking at, growing maybe a small boutique type of operation, or you want to be the next unicorn, the next Zoom or Apple or whatever, it really is about having the long-term goal, bringing it back to shorter-term objectives, and then what we used to say was plan high, and then execute ruthlessly. You've got to be focused on doing what you need to do every day, every week, every month.
It is about the baby steps.
And even if it's a side hustle, when you're starting, those principles apply.
Yeah, that's great. So imagine I wanted to open like a fashion company. So you mentioned the first step obviously would be to kind of like know your goal and to like make those objectives and make sure you stick to them, also while looking after your well-being. So what's step 2? So now, you have this you have your idea, you've made little steps working towards this. That could be, I guess, like buying the domain name and, like maybe having like a draft, a business plan. What would be like the second step to really get it to scale up?
So the business plan is not always a quick and easy thing, because as you move more into the cycle of growing the business, you learn things, you come across things you weren't expecting, and so you need to be somewhat flexible. The next step, though, is to start building your networks, getting known, making sure you're building up the right partnerships. So if you want to, for instance, get into a physical bricks and mortar retail fashion store, you need premises, but you also need suppliers. You need to decide your niche so that you know how to reach and who to reach your potential market. And, you need to find that USP, your unique selling proposition. What is it that's going to make you stand out and succeed? While you're still at university, you've got a couple of years still to go. That's ideal. And for people that are, as I've mentioned just now, like a side hustle, it's really quite advantageous if you've got a job already and you're starting, because you can kind of do it step by step without the pressure of how am I going to feed, myself at the end of the month and pay my rent and so on. So you can start building up networks, you can start getting exposed, going to conferences or fashion shows or things like that, and networking, so that by the time you want to shift your focus to kind of solely working in that business, you've already established that ecosystem that you need.
It's amazing. And that's really good. Yeah, that's really good advice. That makes a lot of sense. And you mentioned that you coach leaders.
Yeah.
So what do you think is like the most common mistake that you see within these leaders? What like during their step, for example, if they have already a business or if they don't have a business yet, what is like the most common thing that you, like as a pattern that you see with every leader? What's like that one thing that maybe they're making a mistake in, or maybe that they're complaining to you about, like their biggest failure, something like that? What do you think it is?
So, yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah? Okay, good.
And I have a good answer.
Fantastic.
So I'm going to talk about once you kind of underway, out of the first kind of, let's call it the incubation stage. There are two things that any business owner needs to do. You need to work in your business. You need to do stuff, because until you're at a certain size, you're not going to just kind of sit there in your corner office and have everybody else do the work. Yeah. But the biggest mistake or gap that I see is people don't work on their business. So you got to work in your business, but that's a job, right? You're in the operations, you're doing whatever when you're small, admin, HR, things like that. But working on your business is the strategy side. And that's where you take a step back and you say, okay, I've got to this point. What am I going to do to position myself for where I want to be next year this time? So that's really strategy. And if I say to business leaders or ask them, how much time do you spend on those strategic objectives versus the operational stuff? They say, 20%. So I say, well, 20% is one whole day a week. People don't find time to do that. And so we focus on everything that's urgent, that saying that the squeaky wheel gets the oil. So business leaders get so tied down in the busyness of their business that they don't take enough time to step back. So what are the technology trends? In a fashion business, what's next year's Mould?
Yeah, what's next year's colors?
Exactly.
What's the patterns?
Yeah. And how do I position my business to take advantage of those and exploit whatever opportunities there are? So that working on the business is generally 90% of what I help business leaders, get into and focus on.
Wow. And you do this often?
Yeah.
You see leaders often?
Yeah, and it's not just in smaller businesses. Some of my clients are sort of senior leaders in multinationals. And even if you're, in most of their cases, part of a fairly big, but still just a part of a business, even they have their strategy. So you have the company strategy, divisional, but, even for your own team, you've got strategic objectives.
Yeah.
So it's still important to take that time, carve it out, take the step back and look into the future.
Yeah. What do you think makes a great leader?
So that's another good question. And there's no definite answer to that. I mean, there's an author called Daniel Goleman who people might know as the kind of, not the inventor, but the person who made emotional intelligence a kind of current
like
topic.
A skill. Yeah.
Yeah. So he invented, what is EQ all about and so on. And he says there are 6 leadership styles. And today
Wait, let me guess them.
Okay.
Is it democratic? Because I learned this in GCSE, A-level business.
Yeah.
Is it democratic, autocratic?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's one like that. Dictator, is that one style?
That's kind of like
laissez-faire.
autocratic.
Okay,
Yeah.
I got 4. Okay,
Yeah.
I think there's more. Go ahead.
Okay, so there's like coercive.
Yeah.
But on the kind of more valuable and more, let's say, best practice side, going further than democratic, you talk about like a servant leader. So good leaders today see themselves as being there to enable and empower the people that work for them. And in fact, one way to think about it is we always draw an organization as a pyramid.
Yeah.
But coming from that kind of people first and customer first perspective, you turn that pyramid upside down. So that shows you that the leadership, especially like the real senior leadership, is there to support the rest of the business. And actually the people then at that widest level, they're actually at the coalface. They're the people that deal with your customers, your suppliers, and so on. And in fact, we mentioned coaching. So the concept of the leader as coach is also something that most leaders aspire to. But it does take emotional intelligence and it does take maturity in themselves and in their jobs as well.
Yeah, I think I've always seen a diagram on Instagram actually of, the difference between a boss and a leader. A boss will just use employees to get himself to the top, whereas a leader will, get to the top and then help everybody else get on top as well. So yeah, I think that's really cool. That's a great analogy. So as a student personally, I feel like a lot of my colleagues at university, but also me at one point in my life, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And I didn't know what kind of career plan I wanted. I feel like now I've got it kind of pinned down straight, but before I was very confused. So what kind of advice, how do you help people find that direction with themselves? What would you advise a university student who doesn't know what to do with themselves?
So I mentioned passion earlier, and that's probably the first place to look in what really feeds you. You know, what do you get energy from partaking in? What are your hobbies and so on? Now, one caveat there, a lot of kind of motivational speakers and the like will say, find your passion and the money will come. Well, I disagree with that. It tends not to, right? And for many people, turning a hobby into a business makes a difficult business and spoils the hobby because it's no longer for fun.
Yeah.
But having said that, you know, there are some kind of business-oriented tools one can use. So we talk about a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And businesses use that quite a lot. It's part of that working on the business, that analysis of their strengths and so on. But if you use that in a personal sense, you can say, well, what are my strengths? Media management, I'm creative, I like dealing with people, I like to share information.
Marketing is perfect for you.
Yes.
Yeah.
But what are my weaknesses? Well, maybe I haven't had experience of like building a detailed business plan and cash flow models and things like that. So the strengths and the weaknesses are generally internal perspectives. What do I have, or once I've started a business, what does my business have that's really a strength, but also what are weaknesses? Because you need to exploit your strengths, leverage them, but you also need to compensate for weaknesses, and you might get a business partner in, you might find a mentor, things like that. And then the O and the T, the opportunities and threats, are, well, pretty much what they say, but they're the external perspective. So in the market I want to move into, and by the way, this all applies to career planning and so on as well.
Yeah.
So if people are looking for what particular niche to move into in a career, it also applies. So the opportunities are what's out there that I can either move into now to position myself for something bigger later, or you know, new trends that I can get into that will maybe help me establish a niche that's not sort of oversaturated.
Yeah.
But on the threats then, let's say I know nothing about AI, but the industry I want to move into or start my business in is becoming heavily AI driven. Well, that's a threat to my survival. So let me focus on
That is such an
learning
interesting way
that.
of looking at things. That is a really, really interesting way of looking at things. I think, what's my threat? Probably AI or like coding or something.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'll give you an example though. I feel like people who get into sales, for example, like there's like a strength of mine, for example, is when it comes to like holidays and stuff, like I want to go on holiday with my friends. So obviously all my friends, they may not like exactly have the funds in that exact moment, but I know how to persuade them, because there's always a way, there's always something that will hit that person that will make them want to go. So for example, like one of my friends, I'll say to her, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity. Like, when's the next time you're going to go with all your friends, you know? And then my second friend, I'll say, well, you haven't left the country. You haven't seen enough of the world, you know? And another friend, I'll tell them, well, we're all going, so you need to come, like, you know, fear of missing out, you know? So I feel like, yeah, so in that type of regard, I think I would be good at sales, but maybe that's underneath marketing, that's why I'm in marketing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I should have hired you a few years ago.
You would have loved me. Yeah, okay, cool. Keith, you mentioned mentorship, you mentioned, you know, like expanding your horizons while still at Greenwich Business School. How can students do that while still being at university? What does the university offer in order for them to kind of like go to these networking events and just build themselves a community that will help them?
Yep. So Greenwich has a great student support set of offerings, if I can put it that way. Firstly, we touched on well-being, so you know that's something people can tap into. But in terms of planning their future, there are events quite often that expose students to different kind of topics and things like that, different fields of business. So people should make use of those as much as possible. Then, within your faculty, within your school, there are obviously like-minded people. So, you know, talk to your lecturers, to your professors. They would be able to point you at maybe special interest groups that, you know, on a topic that's close to your heart.
Yeah.
And mentoring is really good. So find someone who could, let's say, be a role model to you, and, you know, find out what they do pick their brain. Most people in the university are more than happy to help students in any way they can. But then also look wider than the university. So there are online webinars in any topic you can find. There's a lot of online resources. Once you're out of university and in the big wide world, LinkedIn is a very powerful thing where business people hang out. And there are a lot of interest groups and also kind of LinkedIn's version of influencers, knowledge experts, thought leaders. So, there's quite a number of different channels through which you can gain information
100%.
And ideas, really.
Yeah. As a professional, can you please let all of our students know that LinkedIn is really important? Because I feel like sometimes we always tell students, to download LinkedIn, and then that's all we tell them to do. But the power of LinkedIn is crazy. Do you want to touch on that for a second?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example. My wife is in executive recruitment, headhunting. Her company deals with very senior appointments. She lives her life on LinkedIn. Because anybody who's anybody in this world, pretty much anyone who has a job these days is on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
And so people like her, in fact, for those of you who don't know, LinkedIn has a whole job section. So opportunities are posted there. It's easy enough to find trends. You can connect to companies that are in the field that you're interested in. But that's where recruiters will look. That's where you can find business partners if you're starting your own business. And it's where you can really learn. Yeah. And in fact, now that I think of it, there's a third part of it, which is LinkedIn Learning.
Yeah.
It's kind of like Udemy or Coursera, but it's all business focused, including soft skills, leadership, communication, and so on, but all in a business context. So if there's one thing you do, get on LinkedIn and keep it up to date.
You heard it first, guys, from the man himself. To round up the podcast episode, I want to ask you, specifically for our students at the Greenwich Business School, what piece of advice would you give them? Please look at the camera when you're answering this.
Okay.
What advice would you give them if they don't know what they want to do or where they want to end up in life and in their career?
Yet again, a great question. So, to all of you out there watching this, I've mentioned things like passion, finding your strengths and weaknesses, so I won't repeat that part. But I think the one thing is Shakespeare said, one of the characters in Hamlet said, "To thine own self be true, for then you won't be false to any person." And I think that's key, to find your essence, what is your purpose and mission in life? And again, that may not translate into lots of money directly, but as long as you maintain that kind of sense of self, it prevents you burning out. It keeps you away from careers that maybe won't kind of give you a reward and meaning. So I know that's fairly high level and possibly a bit vague, but on top of all the more concrete stuff I've said, I would really recommend that you be true to yourself.
I love that. Thank you so much for joining us, Keith, on this episode. Right, everybody, that was the Greenwich Means Business podcast with Keith Mould. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this podcast, make sure you let all of your friends know and share it on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Okay, thank you guys. See you next episode.
Find this podcast on Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts. Remember to subscribe to never miss an episode. Thank you guys for listening.